Hello everyone, welcome to GSMA mAgri's webinar on how to prioritize agricultural value chains for digital interventions. My name is Panos Lukos. I can see lots of people already have joined the webinar, but let's give it maybe one more minute and then we can start. In the meantime, may I ask the people who are already online if you can send me on the chat channel the city you're calling in from, just to make sure that you can hear me well, and just also to see where you guys are coming from, which organizations and which places, which locations you're calling in from. Thank you. Can you all hear me now well? Can you please write in the chat if you can hear me well? Perfect. I see more people have actually joined, so I think we're okay to start. It's 5 minutes past 10. We have a lot of content to go through. As I mentioned earlier, my name is Panos Lukos. I am the Senior Insights Manager for the mAgri program at GSMA Mobile for Development. And this is the GSMA mAgri webinar on how to prioritize agricultural value chains for digital interventions. The plan is to spend some 35-40 minutes, maybe max, on the actual presentation, and then have some time at the end to cover questions from you. In the meantime, as the webinar progresses, if you have any questions, please feel free. to write them in the chat. And I am here I'm joined by three other members of the team, of the mAgri team, Kate, Danielle, and Matt, who are supporting with moderation of the session. So they will be writing the questions, aggregating the questions on the wall, and we'll try to answer them at the end. Now, before we start, I have a few quick housekeeping notes to share. This webinar is on BlueJeans, naturally. So if there is any problem with the chat function, or if you cannot hear me well, please drop a message on the chat to let us know. And also the fact that it's going to last for an hour between 10 and 11 a.m. GMT. So we will try to answer as many questions as possible today, but any questions that we may not be able to answer at the end due to lack of time, we will follow up with an email afterwards. Also, I would like to say that the webinar will be recorded, and we will make the recording available on the GSMA mAgri website afterwards. Now, the webinar is dedicated to our latest tool, the GSMA mAgri Value Chain Assessment Tool, which we published in December last year, and which you can find in the resources page of the Mobile for Development website. In this slide of the presentation, slide 2, we have a set of questions we would like to answer today. Firstly, we'll start with a quick overview of the tool. The key questions we want to answer here are: what is that tool? Who is it for? And how does it work? We will then cover a set of questions that the tool aims to address and which we face when engaging in a market. The second question is about how to identify priority value chains for agricultural payments digitization. After that, we'll discuss a selection of tools that can help develop an understanding of agricultural procurement in a market. And finally, we will cover the topic of identifying suitable mobile use cases and agribusiness partners who you can work with for digital interventions in agriculture, and how in-depth value chain research can help to do that. So before we start answering these specific questions, I want to take a few minutes to tell you a couple of things about us, about the GSMA and about the mAgri program, and provide a little bit of context about the work that we do. Now, the Mobile Agriculture Program of the GSMA, or mAgri program, as it is also known, is part of the Mobile for Development group, or part of the GSMA of the organization, which is a donor-funded, not-for-profit part, and works with the mobile industry to identify opportunities and deliver innovations that have a socio-economic impact. The mission of the program, of the mAgri program, one of the many programs under Mobile for Development, is to advance the productivity and profitability of smallholder farmers and support their financial inclusion through scalable and commercially sustainable mobile services. In our support model, we bring together not just mobile operators, but also agribusinesses, technology providers, content providers, and the wider development community. The program started some 10 years ago in 2009, and since then we have supported 12 projects targeting information services via mobile phones, and jointly all those 12 projects have reached over 10 million smallholder farmers in Africa and Asia. Supporting the delivery of information services was the program's key focus up until 2 years ago. Since then, the program has changed focus. The focus is actually much broader now, and it supports the design and launch of holistic digital enterprise solutions that enable the transition from paper to digital for a range of systems and processes that happen at the interaction between crop buyers and crop producers, the farmers. So buyers of crops may be agribusinesses, cooperatives, or middlemen, for example, and on the other side we have the farmers, and this intersection between the buyers of the crops and the producers of the crops is what we refer to as the last mile of agricultural value chains. So you will actually hear me referring to the last mile quite a few times during this presentation. We currently have active engagements with mobile operators in 6 markets, 4 in Africa and 2 in South Asia. And we support these mobile operators to develop enterprise solutions aimed at the agricultural vertical. Now, our plans for the coming year are massively exciting. We're looking to convene the industry to share experiences and learnings with industry practitioners, and do so by hosting a range of workshops and events in our target regions and markets. We also have a knowledge sharing program whereby we publish a range of resources such as case studies and reports, market level reports and toolkits. Finally, and that is massively exciting for us, is that we're working at full steam to prepare for the launch of an innovation fund, which will come in June this year. So stay tuned, and there will be a big announcement coming out in due time. Now, just to give you an idea of the context of our work, so that we can understand more about how digitization is perceived by the program and the kind of work that we do in the markets, in the engagement markets. This slide number 4, is actually looking to answer the question, who exactly are the clients for last mile digital solutions? Now, to answer this question, we need to look at how agricultural value chains are structured. Now, first of all, what is an agricultural value chain? A value chain is a complex web of relationships and flows of information, of produce and transactions that take place at the different stages of transformation of the crops, which you can see in this slide on the left-hand side in the red boxes, starting from input supply to producer to broker and so on. As I mentioned earlier, the focus of our work is on the agricultural last mile, which you can see at the bottom of this slide in the gray area. Within agricultural value chains, we can distinguish these 3 main models. On the left, we have the middleman-based model, and these are informal value chains in the blue boxes. And we have also the increasingly more formal models going from left to right, the cooperative-based model in the middle in pink color, and the vertically integrated model in green color on the right-hand side. Now, the majority of exchanges and transactions in the developing world take place within informal, loose value chains, which is the left-hand side model, whereby a farmer may sell to a middleman at the farm gate or take the produce to the local market and sell it there. So, thinking about the question, who are the clients for last mile digital solutions? We can say that the potential for digitalization increases as we move from left to right, as we go from the more loose value chains, which are the middleman-based ones, to the more structured ones on the right-hand side. Entry points, at least initially, are more likely to be in the formal value chains, the vertically integrated ones, where commercial agribusinesses or cooperatives even procure crops from the farmers. Moving on to the next slide, I spoke earlier about holistic digital enterprise solutions, which is basically the essence of the work that we do in the engagement markets. And these are the solutions that agribusinesses and farmers demand to address business challenges that they face when they interact in the last mile in the procurement of crops. Now, on this slide, in slide 5, we have identified the 6 main types of digital solutions where mobile technology can actually address some of these challenges, these pain points that farmers and buyers are facing. Starting from the left-hand side, look at information services. Now, this is an area where farmers often lack skills and access to agri-related information. Farmers often do not follow best practices, and there is an opportunity here for agribusinesses who work with farmers in formal value chains to offer relevant, localized information to farmers as part of an enterprise solution. For example, farmers who are part of a certification program, there's an opportunity for the buyer of the crops to actually train those farmers on how to follow the certification standards and how to develop their skills for that particular crop. Then when it comes to mobile money, the second area here, we know that cash payments are risky, they're costly for agribusinesses and for farmers as well. And to address the pain points of dealing in cash, there is an opportunity for mobile money providers to digitize these payments. And here we're talking about business-to-person payments, so payments that a buyer makes to the farmers for the procurement of crops. But we could also look at government-to-person payments, so payments that the government makes to farmers, for example, for agricultural subsidies. The third area, the third type of solution is that of digital profiles. It is related to digital payments, the previous one. The challenge here is that farmers do not possess formal economic identities. Maybe I should actually stop here and explain what an economic identity is, how we perceive that. So for us, by economic identity, we're referring to a dynamic citizen profile that captures an individual's life events. It may capture assets, and more importantly, it can capture transaction history. So there is an opportunity for mobile technology to support the creation of those economic identities. And that can be done because mobile can be used as an authentication and verification tool, and can also be used to aggregate a range of disparate data points. And I'm referring to transactional data here that mobile money solutions generate when mobile money is used for making payments to the farmers. These data points, the transactional data, when combined with other farm and farmer level data, open up full financial inclusion to farmers, including access to credit, to savings products, and insurance products. So it's massively important in the work we do, and this is the socioeconomic aspect I was talking about earlier. Then if we move to the right-hand side of this table, here we're looking at enterprise solutions for agribusinesses that can also benefit farmers. For example, track and trace systems and farm management systems. These are the fourth digital tool on this slide. These kind of tools respond to the need of agribusinesses to ensure full and real-time visibility in the supply chain for traceability and certification of goods when sourcing from the farmers. And for farmers, it's also very important. In particular, track and trace systems can result in improved efficiency and transparency, and that can be done, for example, by digital receipting. And the last two areas, monitoring and analytics, IoT applications for agriculture and agribusiness analytics. These reflect solutions that are more nascent in developing markets, so they may take a little more time to come to markets. Now, in our engagement work, two questions come up again and again. And they have to do with how we assess the suitability of value chains for digital interventions of this type, and how we identify agricultural organizations operating in suitable value chains that our partners can work with. And to address these questions, we have put together a toolkit, which we named the GSMA mAgri Value Chain Assessment Tool, which is the focus of today's webinar. Moving on to the next slide. This is the agenda for today's webinar. So the first question we want to address is, what is the GSMA mAgri Value Chain Assessment Tool? So the tool, which we also call VCAT, is a framework for analyzing value chains and supporting digital interventions in agriculture. and especially interventions focused on the digitization of agricultural procurement payments. Because these payments and digitization of those payments is actually at the heart of any digital intervention in agriculture. The tool provides instructions, it has recommendations and examples to help you guys analyze value chains for poverty reduction. Now, about who is the main user of the tool. Primarily, the tool is actually aimed at providers of digital financial services. That may be mobile operators, it may be non-MNO mobile money providers who are actually seeking to develop a better rural growth strategy. Agtech companies and other digital agriculture implementers, and I see that we have a lot of you guys on the webinar today. You might also find the tool useful, so all of this information is very relevant to you too. Now, the tool employs a step-by-step approach, which we follow in our engagement markets. And I mentioned earlier that we currently work in 6 markets currently. To identify, using this step-by-step approach, suitable value chains and build a pipeline of agricultural organizations for digitizing agricultural procurement payments. So what the tool offers is a framework. It is a framework designed in a way that facilitates our work, but you're also free to actually adjust the tool to suit your own requirements and just use certain elements of it just to make sure that it is relevant to you. Moving to the next slide. In the meantime, I'm just going to remind you that please feel free to post any questions or comments in the chat. We will have some time at the end to discuss this. This slide, slide 8, what it shows is the various steps of the tool. So I mentioned earlier it's a step-by-step approach. Now the first step on the left-hand side is about assessing the suitability of agricultural value chains for digital interventions. It's called the value chain prioritization step. It aims to produce a list of priority value chains for further research later on. And we will talk about it later in the presentation and discuss it as part of the second question that we aim to address in today's webinar. So once we have a list of priority value chains, we want to develop a basic understanding of the structures in those value chains and identify agricultural organizations that operate in those value chains. And to do that, we move to the second step of the tool, which is called value chain selection and mapping. Outputs from this step of the process are value chain maps and also some profiles, more like basic profiles of agricultural organizations, which are using relevant indicators, and we'll talk about these indicators later on. Now, insights from these maps and profiles can help mobile money providers run a preliminary value chain analysis and ranking of the value chains. And this ranking will allow the identification of the 3 most suitable value chains out of the many value chains that you might have researched already, which we carry over to the next and last step, and that is the in-depth value chain research. And in this last step, we validate findings from the previous steps, preliminary findings, and we produce detailed profiles of these organizations and also maps of the user journeys and use cases for digital interventions. So, with this second question, how can we identify priority value chains for agricultural payment digitization? This question relates to the first step of the tool, which we're going to talk just now. So to answer this question, we have developed a model at the GSMA, a model for identifying priority value chains for agricultural payment digitization. Now, what the model does is it calculates the weighted average score ranging between 1 and 5 of a value chain against 7 indicators. And you can see these 7 indicators on the slide. The higher the number of the score, the more suited the value chain is for digital payments. So 5 is much better than 1. Starting from the left, in terms of indicators, we have value we have the value of agricultural formal sector procurement by value chain, and formal sector procurement by value chain, the second indicator, and so on. Now, the data that for these indicators comes from well-known sources, from the FAO, from the World Bank. However, for some indicators, it may be estimates that we have produced ourselves. Now, you realize that the selection of indicators was not actually random. Now, the first two indicators on the left, these indicators assign a formal procurement score to the value chains. Formal value chains that have established structures and well-defined roles and economic relationships are more likely to offer mobile money providers opportunities to digitize payments, agricultural payments. Hence, the selection of those two indicators to fit into the model. The next two indicators are here to assess the growth potential of value chains. Now, value chains with higher growth potential are more likely to support mobile money-enabled digital payments that are sustainable over the long term. So it actually makes sense to go for this type of value chains over others. The next two indicators, transaction data score, more specifically average size of transactions and frequency of transactions, these are also very important as they help digital implementers assess the suitability of value chains for digital interventions from a payments point of view. Now, mobile money services are best suited for small size transactions. And that has to do with the various limits, the wallet limits, the transaction limits for customers. And it's also known that large payments may require advanced KYC, know your customer, for farmers, to upgrade them into mobile money accounts, which allows large payments to take place. So it actually becomes more complicated. So these indicators here, they actually help mobile money providers to assess the suitability of those value chains for digital payments. And lastly, the model is also looking at interlinkages of value chains and produces the weighted average I mentioned earlier at the end. Moving on to the next slide, slide 11, we have an output example that shows the list of priority value chains for Ghana. So this is actually data that came from the model I talked about earlier. Now you can see here that in Ghana, oil crops and cocoa top the list of priority value chains in the country. You may also see that nuts and rubber follow closely. And these are all value chains of very high importance for the country's economy, economic activity. They're high-value cash crops. They're produced mainly for exports. And these are value chains where the need for transparency of payments is very high. Also high is the need for traceability and for certification programs, especially for value chains such as cocoa and rubber. So just to recap then, this step, value chain of the value chain assessment tool, allows us to identify a list of priority value chains, which we can then take and research further in the following steps of the tool. Moving on to the third question, what tools can you use to improve DFS providers' understanding of agricultural payments? Now, to answer this question, we need to look at the second step of the GSMA mAgri value chain assessment tool, which is called value chain selection and mapping. So this step focuses on the list of priority value chains that we have identified previously in the previous step. And it involves semi-structured interviews with stakeholders working in agricultural organizations that operate in those priority value chains. Now, a key question here is, how do you go about selecting organizations for profiling? What criteria do you actually use for this selection? For us, the most important criteria are three: direct procurement, having a large supplier base, and high frequency of transactions. But let me take these one by one. First, we recommend mobile money providers to create profiles and seek partnerships with agricultural organizations involved in direct procurement and operating in more formal value chains that show a higher degree of crop aggregation. And that crop aggregation can be either in bulking groups, think about it as cooperatives, for example, or at the field clerk level in vertically integrated agribusinesses. We also recommend focus on agricultural organizations that procure from a significant number of farmers. That may be several hundred farmers or even more, as these organizations are likely to offer the highest direct revenue opportunity for the mobile money providers and are likely to offer economies of scale as well. Finally, we suggest focusing on agricultural organizations operating in value chains with high frequency of transactions across a longer harvest season. And that allows mobile money providers to ensure liquidity in rural areas and reduce the need for repeat digital literacy training, which is very costly, very time consuming, and it is a necessity when we only have a small number of payments happening over a short period of time. Now, interviews from these states, and I mentioned that these interviews can be, by the way, either remote, on the phone, or you may decide to have face-to-face interviews. These interviews from these states, their purpose is to generate insights. And by generating insights, you can actually start populating basic profiles of agricultural organizations. These profiles can present key procurement data and information on activities in the last mile, and they're very important because they can help you understand the potential to digitize payments, agricultural payments, that the buyer of crops makes to farmers. And to evaluate this potential, we also suggest you run an assessment of the foundational issues that allow the digitization of agricultural payments. Now, examples of foundational issues or prerequisites in any digital intervention related to payments are the following. Number one, assess whether mobile network coverage, for example, in areas where farmers are located is good. Or estimate the proximity, the availability, the liquidity of mobile money agents in areas where farmers are located. Another one may be about evaluating the suitability of transaction limits and wallet limits to allow farmers to receive those agricultural payments. Or determining whether know your customer KYC requirements are required to enable digital payments in this value chain. And you can find more information about the assessment of the foundational issues and the prerequisites in digitizing agricultural payments in a report we published in June last year, which you can find at the resources page of our website. In this slide 14, you can see an example template we use when profiling agricultural organizations. Now, you can adjust the fields to suit the nature of your digital intervention. However, certain fields such as seasonality, the number of direct payments to the farmers, single transaction value, these are particularly important to those interested in rolling out digital payments using mobile money, as they allow you to build an understanding of the spread of payments across the year, and they offer vital information in formulating your strategy, and we spoke about it in the previous slide. So you can take this, and actually a copy of that is in the tool that you can find on the GSMA mAgri website, and you can adjust it to suit your own nature of the digital intervention. Moving to the next slide, slide 15. Now, a second key output from this stage, from this step of the GSMA mAgri value chain assessment tool, is value chain maps of the most suitable value chains. Now, these maps can help you develop a basic understanding of the structures in those value chains. And this slide has an example of a map for tea value chain in Sri Lanka. A map can include lots of different types of information. So for us, information that is relevant, which we recommend you include in a map, is any of the following. For example, actors participating in value addition, with a focus on those actors interacting with the smallholder farmers. And here you can see farmers, you can see middlemen, and you can see agribusinesses on the right-hand side. Core processes in the value chain and the interactions between the main actors involved in these processes. For example, it might be collection, processing, certification. Products, information, and money flows in the value chain. You can see this here with the colored arrows. Crop sourcing by procurement channel. You may have direct procurements, or you may have own plantations, you may have middlemen, and that helps you understand more about what proportion of the total procurement in a country is actually direct, coming from farmers, as opposed to the other procurement types. And you can also have the total addressable market in the country, which is about the total number of farmers engaged in the value chain nationwide. Moving on to the fourth and last question, how in-depth value chain research can help you identify suitable mobile use cases and agribusiness partners. So to answer this question, I suggest we look at the third step of the value chain assessment tool, which, if you remember, is actually called in-depth value chain research. So this last step on slide 17 of the tool focuses on the agriculture organizations and the value chains that we selected in the previous step. So what this step allows is, it allows digital agriculture implementers to assess the barriers to improved procurement performance, and also allows to assess the competitiveness of the farmers and buyers of crops, as well as the role of mobile money and the agtech sector in addressing some of these pain points. So, as part of this in-depth research, we recommend using semi-structured interviews with key stakeholders in the value chain. That may be farmers, office staff, it may be buying agents, extension officers, to generate a list of outputs. And you can actually see the outputs here. These interviews, by the way, are meant to be much more detailed than the interviews in the previous step. So in terms of outputs, a key output from this step is the detailed profiles of selected agricultural organizations. And to generate those profiles, we're using insights from a range of topics. It may be digital literacy rates, it may be integration of smallholder farmers in the supply chain, farmer training tools, and so on. A second key output from this step is a description of the key activities with an emphasis on those involving farmers and buyers. And that may be farm and farmer profiling, crop collection, receipt issuing, farmer payments, amongst others. Third output is the mapping of key pain points for farmers and agricultural organizations against these activities. Now, these pain points, usually they create inefficiencies in the last mile. They affect systems and processes involved in value addition. So it's important to actually understand what are the key pain points and what is the focus or the target of this digital intervention. And also an assessment of agricultural organizations' readiness to adopt last-mile digital tools, and an identification of the mobile use cases. So what is the purpose of this digital intervention? What are the use cases we're actually trying to address here or roll out in a market? And in this slide 18, you can actually see an example of what I just described to you, of a map of activities and pain points in the tea procurement journey. Now, this example covers the farmer journey. So it focuses on insights from the tea farmer, and similar maps of activities, of course, can be produced for other stakeholders. For example, the purchasing clerk, the agri-extension officer, and naturally, these stakeholders interact with each other, so an activity may appear twice, but the pain points are specific to the particular stakeholder. So in this case, you're actually looking at the farmer's point of view and how the various inefficiencies or pain points in the last mile affect the farmer. So before we close, I want to actually share the highlights of the value chain assessment tool. We talked about 3 different steps. described at the start of this presentation. First is the value chain prioritization step. So we are actually using a model built by the GSMA to assess the priority value chains for digital interventions in agriculture. And the model is built using 7 indicators. So the potential to digitize agricultural procurement payments is greater in formal value chains, experiencing high transaction frequency and transaction values that are compatible with mobile money transaction and wallet size limits, of course. And that is where the KYC requirement comes in. The second step we talked about is the value chain selection and mapping step. So it involves creating profiles of agricultural organizations based on key procurement indicators and last mile activities. And it gives mobile money providers a basic understanding of the value chain structures that will allow them to assess the suitability of particular value chains for digital payments. And to maximize the benefits for the farmers, the digital implementers should profile and seek opportunities for partnership with organizations that are involved in direct procurement and that procure from a significant number of farmers. And the last step we talked about was the in-depth value chain research. And this step actually helps to create these detailed profiles of agricultural organizations and then map the activities across the value chain steps, as well as the pain points that affect those activities. So it's making use of field observations and semi-structured interviews with key stakeholders at those agricultural organizations, and aims to identify the inefficiencies that happen in the last mile and how digital tools can address this. So that takes us to the end of the presentation. I would highly encourage you to look at the tool on the GSMA mAgri resources page and use that to guide your value chain analysis activities. If you're a mobile money provider with an interest in digitizing the agricultural last mile, we have a few additional resources to share with you, which you can see on this slide. First, we can send you estimates of the potential direct revenue opportunity for a selected number of markets, where you can actually see what is the potential for business-to-person payments digitization, as well as government-to-person payments digitization. Secondly, we can also share a list of priority value chains for a select number of markets. Value chains that are likely to be suitable for further analysis and follow-up activities. And this list of priority value chains is coming from the model I described earlier, the model that we built in-house at the GSMA. And last but not least, we encourage you to join the GSMA mAgri Priority Learning Partners Group, the PLP group, for accessing fantastic knowledge-sharing activities and to share your own experiences, as well as learn from others from digitizing the last mile. Now, we've had a lot of questions coming in through the webinar, so I'm not sure we're going to have enough time to cover them all. I will try to cover as many as possible in the remaining 15 minutes or so. Before we move to the Q&A, I will pause for a minute to allow the audience to post any additional questions, and then we can start addressing them. I think we can start now. I see lots of questions in front of me. One question that came in is about the weightings that we use in the model in the value chain prioritization stage, and how we actually work out these weightings for each of the indicators, the 7 indicators I mentioned earlier. Naturally, we have assessed the importance of each of these indicators to the model and how important these are to the total final score, the weighted average. So we decided to actually use the weights that you can see on this slide 11, based on this assessment. Naturally, it's our own view, it's our own personal assessment, but our view is that you're more than welcome to actually use your own weights if you were to build a model of this type, and this is only an idea here. So someone may decide that, for example, the average size of transaction is not going to be only 5%, it can be 10% or 15%. So that would probably give you a different set of priority value chains at the end. So so just to kind of recap, sum up what I just said is that the selection of the indicators and the weights of the indicators are based on our own assessment of the importance of these indicators to the total weighted average score. Another question that came in is what we mean by agricultural extension flow in slide 15. So in this slide, so this is a value chain map I discussed earlier. Agricultural extension is the dissemination, if you like, of agronomic advice, relevant information from the agribusiness buyer to the farmer on how to better cultivate the crops, what are the good agricultural practices they can follow, what are the right times for sowing the crop or irrigation or for harvest of the crop, how can the farmer understand the various methods that can be used for addressing diseases and pests that these crops suffer from. So it is anything that has to do with agronomic advice that the agribusiness may want to disseminate to the farmer. And that dissemination often happens in groups of farmers. So it happens in rather large groups, and we've seen that in the markets where we engage. It is very few times that one-to-one support takes place. And in many of the markets where we engage, when we're talking about agri-extension coming not from the agribusiness, but from the government, from the state, from the Ministry of Agriculture, that doesn't happen often. It's actually a very rare, if you like, opportunity for farmers to build their capacity. So it often relies to the agribusiness buyers of the crops to play this role of agricultural extension when buying from farmers. Now, I see another question here about, so somebody's asking, if you have a list of priority value chains coming out of the model at the value chain prioritization step of the tool, why do you need to do any follow-up research on these priority value chains? Why can't you actually use the list of priority value chains from the first step, from the value chain prioritization step? Why do you need to actually go and talk to these agribusinesses and not start developing a tool using this set of value chains? Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, for GSMA mAgri, value chain prioritization makes use of a model that we built internally with support from another unit of the GSMA Intelligence. Now, the model uses those 7 indicators I mentioned, and data is coming from various sources. Some data is actually our own estimates, but data may also be coming from the FAO and the World Bank. And more specifically for indicators such as the volume of production by value chain, we use country-specific data. For example, the volume of production of cocoa in Ghana. However, for other indicators, such as the frequency of transactions and the average size of transactions, which you can see on this slide in the red columns. These are produced, these are estimates we have produced at global level, and we have rolled out across all countries that see production of this particular value chain. In other words, we follow a top-down approach for these particular indicators. Now, the process I described poses two questions, basically. First, whether the top-down approach applies equally across countries. In other words, whether the frequency of cocoa transactions in Cote d'Ivoire, for example, is actually the same as the frequency of cocoa transactions in Papua New Guinea, or in Indonesia, in Ecuador, in another cocoa-producing country. And this is something that the model cannot give information on. And in addition to this, the model is built using secondary data. And the reality is that the situation on the ground may be very different. And this is particularly true in agriculture because there's so many variables that come into play and that can impact the way procurement happens. So it may be regulation, it may be the formality in the last mile in a market versus another, and so on. So there's a lot of value in this list of priority value chains because it allows us to prioritize which value chains to research in the next steps. However, it is not enough for drawing a strategy, a mobile money provider's rural strategy, using only this information. So the tool produces a list of priority value chains, and these priority value chains can certainly feed into the next step, and then at the next step, value chain selection and mapping, we can see whether the assumptions and the information that the model gave us is actually relevant, and whether we can actually build onto that to with further research in the following stages of the process. I have one more question here. From a mobile money provider who's actually saying, I'm a mobile money provider with little agricultural knowledge, where do I start? Great question. I would say the first step is to actually talk to us. We have a lot of resources. We have a dedicated market engagement team. These guys are very willing to talk to you. We have guidance to offer, materials, tools, and everything. As I said earlier, we can share estimates of the direct revenue opportunity for selected countries. We can share a list of priority value chains. And another action we highly recommend you take is to get into contact with your agribusiness clients, as they are almost certainly facing challenges when procuring crops from farmers. And what these clients may not know is that, mobile technology might be very useful in addressing some of these challenges. So within your enterprise clients list or group, if you like, there are certainly organizations that operate in this space. So talk to them, talk about their activities, about their challenges and the various pain points they're facing, map out how procurement works for them, and use the tool, the value chain assessment tool in the process, and please get back to us to share your insights and tell us how this worked for you and how we can support you further. There's another question about the 6 digital opportunities for digitization. The question is that we make no mention of finance or loans, and if we can actually clarify that. So that actually falls under payments. So cash payments, as I mentioned earlier, are very risky and costly. And when we talk about payments, we don't necessarily only refer to payments that happen from the buyer of the crops to the producer of the crops, from the agribusiness to the farmer for the procurement of crops. Payments may also come in the form of loans to the farmers, and that is a common practice. Many of these farmers are not financially included. So that means that these farmers, when they need access to credit, they can really go to a bank or to a microfinance institution. So the buyers of the crops, the agribusinesses, often become the source of credit for those farmers. And that credit may come in regular intervals. It may be a pre-financing at the start of the month, and we've seen that in tea value chain that I mentioned earlier, whereby we have a single payment for the previous month's procurement happening at the end of the month, but a pre-financing may also happen at the start of the month so that farmers have enough money to get by until the payment for that month comes in. So definitely financing and loans, credit to the farmers falls under this second area of the 6 that we mentioned, the payments area, and there is a great opportunity here for mobile money to play a role in digitizing agricultural payments to the farmers for the procurement of crops, but also to digitize the various payments to the farmers in the form of credit or pre-financing I mentioned just now. And this is very important because it allows the farmers to create this digital footprint, if you like. When payments happen only in cash, farmers operate in the informal economy. So for banks, for formal financial institutions to serve these farmers is actually very difficult. And the difficulty relies on the fact that they know nothing about those farmers, so it is very hard to apply the very generic products that they have, credit products and so on, to the farmers and offer them access to credit. So by digitizing some of these payments and generating digital transactional data using mobile money, we can support the development of the economic identities of those farmers. It is this digital footprint that can help build that economic identity. And by building that economic identity, we can open up the path to financial inclusion. We never said that this is going to be an easy process. Financial inclusion cannot happen from one day to the next, but it can certainly help to allow those farmers to create this digital footprint and slowly and steadily gain access to more complex formal financial services. Now, this is the 1 minute to 11. I'm afraid we haven't got any more time for additional questions. We have actually noted any other questions that you guys have shared on the chat channel. So we will get back to you, drop you an email. In the meantime, if you do have any other questions, please feel free to drop us an email. The presentation, as I mentioned, the slides will be available for download with the recordings on our website. And so please check back on the website, and certainly please use the mAgri@gsma.com address to inquire further information on this or to join the PLP group I mentioned earlier. As I mentioned, the tool is on the resources page of the website. It's been a pleasure talking to you today and answering your questions, and I look forward to the next opportunity to do that again in the future. Have a good day and talk to you soon.